This is a session that we're feeling excited about. It's a wonderful opportunity to learn from some of the great traditions of the world and actually look at some of the rituals, traditions, and practices that they have, and perhaps reflect on ways that they might inspire us in our own lives, or for those of us who are part of those traditions to deepen into that practice. We're feeling, and I'm feeling wonderfully excited about the three speakers that we have with us today, the three guests. David, Rabbi David from Jerusalem, Father Timothy, who's dialing in from Oxford, and Imam Yahya, who's dialing in from Bologna today. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us for today's session. We're gonna start diving right in by inviting David to share with us from the Jewish tradition. And David is gonna be speaking to us about the Shabbat. And if I was to say any more, I'd be doing it a great disservice in the face of what's to come. So David, I'd love to pass it to you.
Thank you, Aaron. Aaron's perspicacious knowledge specifically focused on the Shabbat as an example of Jewish ritual. And that's extremely important because, in fact, the Shabbat is the central regular ritual of Jewish life. As you know, the Sabbath is referred to in the Decalogue, in the Ten Commandments, with the famous words, 6 days shall you work, on the seventh day you shall rest. And the rest is associated both with the idea of resting from creation, as well as, in fact, the idea of the sense of the divine within history related to the Exodus. But the central idea of this day is that our creativity, our capacities for developing our skills, for being able to contribute to the world, which are, of course, the great divine gift, are wonderful opportunities, wonderful blessings for us to be able to contribute. But there is a danger that these things can overtake us entirely, and that our work can become the totality of our existence. It's not the idea that the work is bad. On the contrary, 6 days shall you work. We should be creative. But in the ancient world, in the agricultural world, the whole agricultural cycle and activity could just totally consume and take over your whole life. In the modern world, technology, which is such a gift and a reflection of human creativity, can totally dominate our existence. We become dependent upon things that we create, that we are able to develop. We today will often not think of walking distances that our great-grandparents wouldn't have thought of not walking. And of course, it applies to so many areas of computers and of cell phones and things which actually tend very often to control us. So the challenge is how to be able to ensure that our creativity is a blessing without it, in fact, stifling our spirituality, stifling our sense of our inner world, stifling our sense of our relationship with our family, with friends, with community. So the Sabbath tries to restore that equilibrium, to enable us to continuously rediscover the divine presence within us and around us. In effect, what prayer is in Judaism is rooted within the idea of a blessing. A blessing is an expression of appreciation. Within Jewish tradition, before you eat or you drink anything, you make a blessing. So it's not simply automatic. It's what today we might call mindfulness. It's consciousness. It's an expression of appreciation and awareness. And the Sabbath is a day that seeks to do that, so that we don't take things for granted. It is a remarkable discipline, and it's a very difficult discipline if it's not something one has imbibed with one's mother's milk. It is, however, an enormous gift. And indeed, within Jewish tradition, the Sabbath is described as God's greatest gift to Israel. It's the Sabbath that enables us to maintain that sense of our spiritual connectedness, our sense of family and community. So let me, I could of course go on for quite a bit talking about the idea of the Sabbath, but specifically with a ritual, let me focus on the Friday night meal. In fact, on the Sabbath is meant to be a day of celebration. a day of pleasure, a day of good food, good drink, but a day also of prayer and of fraternity and of community. And in fact, the ideal is to have at least 3 good meals on the Sabbath, beginning from sundown for essentially a period of 25 hours to ensure that it's a full day. And the Sabbath, if you live within a self-contained Jewish community or here in Israel, a siren will sound on Friday around dusk, indicating that the Sabbath is about to commence. And within observant traditional homes, all preparations will have been done beforehand. The house will be cleaned. You will have dressed in lovely clothes, in a smart clothes or aesthetic clothes for the occasion, should I say. And the lady of the house, or ladies of the house very often, will have brought the Sabbath in by lighting the Sabbath candles. And then there will be Sabbath evening prayers. And then people will gather, will come home or from wherever they have prayed. And then the Sabbath commences with singing a song of welcome to the Sabbath angels. This idea of the Sabbath angels is based on an ancient homily that says, in every home on a Friday night, 2 angels come to visit. One is a good angel and one is a bad angel. If they see that the table is laid, the tablecloth is laid, the table is prepared for a lovely banquet, and the candles are lit, and the wine is there to be able to sanctify the Sabbath day, then the good angel says, so may it be on all future Sabbaths, and the bad angel has to answer, Amen. But if they arrive and the table is not prepared, the house has not been prepared for the occasion, there is no bread on the table, there is no wine to sanctify the day, then the bad angel says, may it be such on all future Sabbaths, and the good angel has to answer, Amen. The idea behind this is a very beautiful idea. At the heart of religion, at the heart of spirituality is spontaneity. But if it's just spontaneous, then very often it won't happen. In fact, precisely what I was speaking about before, we get so consumed up with our workday activities, with our professions, with our businesses, with our activities, that it all takes us over. And therefore we need that discipline in which there is the day set aside, where the rituals are prepared, where the house is arranged, where the family comes together in order to be able to ensure that the spiritual essence is there. So there's an important combination of what we could call form and substance. And traditionally, the psalm from Proverbs, the passage from Proverbs chapter 30, a woman of valor will be sung. This is very often a tribute to the lady of the house, but the truth is that its origin is amongst the mystics, the medieval mystics, who saw the Sabbath as a bride and the community as the groom. And there's a kind of a mystical union in this particular celebration. And after singing these welcoming songs, it's traditional very often for the parents to bless the children. Once again, family comes together. Very often in our modern world, if it wouldn't be for the specific occasion, family wouldn't come and eat together. The beauty of the Sabbath is that it binds family, brings family, deepens those bonds. It takes us to the synagogue, giving us the sense of community, our connectedness. It's all together. The Sabbath meal begins with a blessing over wine, as most formal rituals do within Jewish tradition. And that blessing extols and gives thanks to God for creation, for the cosmos, for the beauty of the world around us, for this day of rest that we are now partaking of. And then everybody normally participates from the wine. And then hands are washed in preparation for the breaking of the bread. Traditionally, there are 2 loaves on the table, which represent the double portion of manna for the children of Israel when they were in the wilderness. You will remember the biblical story that when the children of Israel were in the wilderness, the food came down from heaven for them, was called manna. And on the eves of Sabbaths and festivals, they had a double portion so they wouldn't have to go out and glean it on the Sabbath. And the 2 loaves represent that double portion, 2 loaves of bread. So the meal begins with the wine and bread, which of course Christians will be familiar in terms of its relationship to communion, which of course highlights the common origins. And then normally it is a sumptuous meal, good food, good beverage, and there's also good talk and good song. It's traditional to be able to comment upon the portion of the sequential reading from the Pentateuch that takes place in the synagogue. A little portion from the Torah is read every week, throughout the course of the year in an annual cycle, and then to talk about some of the insights, but also to sing together. Song has, of course, enormous power and is another form of bonding and binding and celebration together. And the Sabbath meal ends with grace after meals. I always like to say that we Jews are a rather suspicious lot. We're not sure that we're grateful for what we are about to receive at the beginning of the meal. We want to receive it first, and then if we really enjoy it, then we have a very big thank you. And that grace actually takes rather a long time, which is thanking God not only for his sustenance and for his blessings, but also for the land and also for his provenance and providence and his presence continuously with us. So the Sabbath meal is an opportunity to be able to reflect upon the gifts and blessings that we are part of, to be able to celebrate these together with family. And of course, there's a very important aspect of having guests. In most traditional homes, there will be guests on the Sabbath to share your blessings with others, because sharing, of course, adds so much more to the sense of the gift and our appreciation and our responsibility, that as we have received gifts, to be able to share them with others. As I said at the beginning, and I will conclude with this, it's very difficult to be able to introduce a discipline into your life if this is not something that you have grown up with. Very difficult. And especially when it comes to areas like restricting a day so that you wouldn't travel on that day, or you wouldn't operate your computer on that day, or you wouldn't operate your cell phone on that day, etc. Once we get into these technological modes, they tend to subsume us and control us. But it is possible. It is possible. And even if you can't take on a whole day, I think it's possible to set aside at least a morning a week, or at least an afternoon and an evening a week. And when the intrusions of modern technology do not control our lives in the same way, where one can set aside to come together with loved ones, where one can set it aside for some form of service to others. Setting aside time, which is what the Sabbath is all about, is a key to being able to enabling us to appreciate our lives, to appreciate God's gifts, and to appreciate one another. Thank you.
David, thank you. We're going to see some themes as each of the three share. And Timothy, I know that you're looking to share about the way that a meal also plays a really, really fundamental role in the Christian context. Though I think you need to unmute.
There we are. Yes, absolutely. And it was an enormous pleasure for me to listen to David, because it reminded me of how my Christian faith is rooted in Judaism. So when I listen to David, I really feel at home in everything that he said. I'd want to begin with something which isn't about a meal so much. French philosopher Pascal said, "All the ills of humanity come from our inability to sit in a room alone and be still." And I think a lot of us during this lockdown have spent a great deal of time sitting in our rooms, perhaps sometimes going mildly crazy. I think this period of social isolation has been quite painful, because time becomes shapeless. Usual structures, the usual family celebrations, going to work, returning from work, all of them have collapsed. And so if we're to live contentedly, we have to shape our days. Now, the daily rituals of my Dominican community are intended to shape each day. Now, we are children of Judaism, and so we also begin the day in the evening. We let the day go. The first two prayers of Vespers and Compline are about letting the tensions, the conflicts of the past day pass. St. Paul said, "Do not let the sun go down on your anger." So before we go to sleep, we need some reconciliation, some peacemaking. Otherwise, we're not going to sleep. And then in the morning, we start with what's called Lord's. And that's turned to the future. We greet the new dawn, the new day with new possibilities. And it's interesting that the song of the morning is referring to a child, the young John the Baptist, who will go before the Lord to prepare his ways. Children are a sign of the new, what you cannot anticipate. I remember I was in Rwanda during the genocide, and one of my brethren had worked all his life to try and launch interesting, good, helpful projects. And when he came into his office, he found that everything had been destroyed. All the work of his life was over, and we wept. But the next Christmas, he sent me a card with 2 little Rwandan children, and he said, Rwanda has a future. So in morning, you open yourself to the future. And I think people need to connect with the future sometime in the day with their children, their grandchildren, whatever points beyond. And the midday prayers are about the most difficult thing, which is living now, in the present, in this time, in this place. We're always tempted to think that if we were elsewhere, things would be a great deal easier. I would be thinner and I would be able to sing properly. All my problems would disappear. So I think if we have a rhythm of the day where we let go of the past in the evening, open ourselves to the future in the morning, there's a good chance we'll be able to live now. And now we come to the meal. And this is where we see continuity with what David was talking about, the Eucharist. And our Eucharist is Jewish in origin. It's the Passover meal that Jesus celebrated just before he died, when he faced suffering and death. And it is our great celebration of hope. Funnily enough, I understood this also for the first time in Rwanda, just at the very beginning of the genocide. We were staying in the capital, Kigali, and we had to go up to the north of the country to see our sisters who were in the middle of the fighting. It was a terrible day. We met soldiers from both sides of the conflict. We visited a camp filled with refugees. But the worst moment was when we visited a hospital which was filled with maimed children who'd lost their legs and their arms in the conflict, particularly from landmines. I shall never forget this kid who lost both his legs and an arm and an eye. And his father sat beside him weeping. And I wept too. And we hobbled out into the bush with 2 kids who'd only got 1 leg each, weeping. When I got to my sisters, the house was pockmarked with bullets. And I knew I was supposed to say something, but I thought, what can I say? What can I say? And then I remembered that I had something to do. There was something I could do. I could celebrate a ritual of the Eucharist, which remembers that last night of Jesus, when there seemed to be no future, when everything seemed to be falling apart. And the disciples were about to desert and deny him. And at that moment, he did something extraordinary. He took the bread and he said, this is me. This is my body. I give myself to you. This is my blood for the new community. So for us Christians, it's the great celebration of hope in the darkest moment. So now to conclude, how can secular people or people of another religion, how can they resonate with this ritual in the face of despair, this ritual of hope? And I think one of the ways we do it is when we gather together to celebrate, just as David describes, in fact, in the Shabbat and in the Passover, when we gather together in the face of dispersal and suffering, we defy it with our joy. We defy it with our songs. I was delighted that David twice mentioned the importance of song. A common way for human beings to express hope in the face of death or difficulty or suffering is to sing, to make music. There's an Arabic saying, when danger approaches, sing to it. Let me just conclude with two examples. The first in April 2015, when 19 people were killed by car bombs in the west of Baghdad. And Karim Wasfi, who is the head of the Iraqi National Symphony Orchestra, he went to the site of the bombs, he took his cello, he sat among the wreckage, and he played music. He played a song he'd composed called Baghdad Morning Melancholy. He said, I wanted to show beauty in the face of ugliness. And I think this has Eucharistic resonances, the way we celebrate in the face of death. Or very briefly, Leningrad, 1942, the city surrounded, three-quarters of a million people died of starvation. How did they face it? They celebrated. They got an orchestra together to play Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony. They blasted it out. And music and celebration express our hope when sometimes things seem hopeless. For me, all these came together in Syria about 4 years ago, when I was staying just about 3 or 4 miles from the front line with so-called ISIS. We were kept awake by the guns all the night. But in the morning, we went to the Eucharist and we sang beautiful, haunting Arabic songs. And they were our expression of a hope which does not die. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Timothy. I love the ways that you guys are connecting with one another as well. The threads in between are so beautiful. And Yahya, I'd love to pass it to you.
Thank you very much, Aaron, and good evening from Italy and to all of those who are in Europe, and good morning for those who are in other regions of the world and this is actually allows me to start with the symbol that I would like to present in this context, which is the explanation of a ritual in Islam in a specific context. The context is the month of Ramadan, which is the name of one of the 12 lunar months of Islamic calendar. And the ritual is the ritual of fasting, where Muslims who are not traveling and who are not in difficulties of health and are observing their sensitivity as believers in the religion of Islam, they fast from sunrise to sunset for the whole month, which means approximately being a lunar month for 29 or 30 days. And so the reason why there is a correspondence with saying good morning or saying good evening is that the context actually changes, because during these 29 days and nights, Muslims in the world fast from sunrise to sunset, but in different moments according to where they stand. And that's not only the first difference, but an unity in diversity, but there is another unity in diversity, which is more complex. It's linked to the fact that in some places, fasting might be very long, because you might have sunrise at a very early hour of the morning and sunset at a very late moment of the day. And in other places of the world, you would have a shorter period for fasting due to the fact that the sun would be present in a shorter time. So there is an occasion in the contextualization of this ritual that allows Muslims and believers, if I may say, to consider the relation with time and space, the unity in diversity of where we are staying and what we are doing, and how things change according to how long is our day or how long is the light where we can witness the sun, and how long is the night when we can in somehow witness the stars or the absence of light. So there is this contextualization or cosmological symbolism between the believer in this specific months, and the specific ritual of this month is fasting, which is very impractical, because one could say that actually it consists only in fasting and not eating and not drinking from sunrise to sunset for 29 or 30 days. But our masters teach us that the symbolism in this ritual should not only give us as a consequence the lack of something to eat or the need of something to drink. In other ways, there is a deeper meaning and symbolism in fasting, in having hunger or having a thirst, that is to rediscover the deeper dimension of being thirsty and being hungry, not only for, of course, physiological or material or natural needs of our body, but also for spiritual and intellectual research, for something that we are not probably so used to consider, and that through fasting we might rediscover. And this is in somehow the secret that masters teach Muslims to reconsider during fasting. It's not only a sacrifice, it's not only something that we are refraining from our instinct to have to follow our hunger or our daily meal or any situation of physical needs, but it's actually to act through a non-action, through something which is leaving to, if I may say, a spiritual dimension to act. And we host this spiritual action through our refraining from an individual, personal, physical, material action. So it's a very, if I may say, alchemical relation, because through preventing our action of fasting, we actually host a spiritual action in our hearts, and through our hearts in the integrality of our person and action. So we somehow rediscover that the kingdom of action is not our personal mind, is not our habits, is not our physical instincts, or it's not only our physical instincts and habits and mind, but it is also an inspiration that comes from beyond ourselves, but also from our hearts. So there is a reality, a spiritual reality that and somehow inspires the harmony of action through a non-action of mankind. And in this sense, Muslims, through their fasting, are in somehow hosting the action of peace in themselves and in the outer responsibilities. Because what is quite interesting is that although we are fasting for the whole day, for 29 or 30 days from sunrise to sunset, but every Muslim needs to be consistent with his responsibilities. So he has to study, he has to work, and he has to continue his duties. But nevertheless, he has to find, or rather discover, the power of an inspiration that allows him to fulfill his responsibilities although he is fasting, and not suffering or complaining for his fastings or for his thirst, but in somehow hosting and with a surprise of how in somehow he's able to go beyond his natural strength to in somehow serve the power of divine presence in him through his fasting. So it's a very special way of considering fasting, which is again not a diet, but it's really to discover the action of something which is constantly inspiring our role in also in this world and in society. And the last symbol would be the symbol of break fasting, of breakfast in the evening, when we actually share, as it was mentioned by Rabbi Rosen, we share in a community, in a family, the meal that breaks our fast every evening before going together for prayer. So fasting and prayer are strictly linked, but this breaking of the fast has a very symbolic but also emotional dimension, because you can imagine that after a whole day and every day of fasting for 29 or 30 days, this evening of a meal is a very blessed moment, emotionally, but also symbolically. And in some, according to some cultures, of course, if you go to the Far East, you might find persons, Muslims, breaking fast with chopsticks. And if you go to Italy, you might find the persons breaking fast with pizza and spaghetti and a fork. But not to make a cultural dimension, but I would like to conclude with this symbol, which is in the desert. I witnessed a breaking of the fast with, let's say, 10 brothers and sisters. And a plate was served at the center of the table for all of us, a big circle full of rice, and each one of us was taught to try to start from the edge, going toward the center with his right hand. And you would see the 10 persons around this dish sharing in somehow this meal, going from their personal point of reference to the center. And I think that in this symbolism, in this teaching, our right arm acts like a rayon of the sun. And it gives us the idea of sharing the breaking of the fast, but also sharing the meal and going together towards the center where we can feel united and eventually rediscover in different ways how peace and harmony are part of a spiritual inspiration through fasting and through the sharing of a meal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yahya. We've been really excited about putting this session together because it was a chance to learn from these great traditions and to be inspired in different ways with our own lives or to deepen in our practice. And we'd love to invite your questions. I saw in the chat that already one person has said, who I know is Jewish, that she's going to practice the Shabbat, which is wonderful. And are there other questions that people might have? And as you're sharing that in the chat, David, Timothy, Yahya, are there thoughts that come up for you in having listened to each other, or places that you might think might be wonderful to deepen into, or invitations that you think might be a good one for this community?
Well, the only thing I might just resonate with is how much both my colleagues are also in different ways talking about boundaries and the importance of boundaries in our lives, not in order to be able to keep people out, but precisely in order to be able to emphasize what is precious. And I think this is a big challenge on a much broader spectrum. In effect, it's the challenge of how do we maintain what is special that each of us have in our own different ways, personal, communal, and through our faith heritages or whatever our heritages may be, and at the same time feel totally connected with others beyond those borders. And I think with my colleagues, there was that resonance. I think the big challenge of our times is how to be able to find a creative balance between the particular and the universal. I know, I'm sure John Lennon had the best of intentions in his song Imagine, but it is a little bit not just disingenuous, but in fact counterproductive, because if you try to reduce everyone to the lowest common denominator, in other words, there are no differences at all, then in fact you have a very poor and very limited world, a very impoverished world. But if you appreciate that there's differences between families, between communities, and the differences between eating and non-eating, fasting, celebration, prayer, silence, that each one of those are different elements that contribute to the diversity of human existence, and our different cultures and national heritages and religious traditions are part of that beauty that can contribute to the world at whole, then we can have a real sustainable universalism. In other words, a universalism that comes out of our particularity is that we have to strive for. When we try to reduce ourselves to the lowest common denominator, thinking that if we don't have difference, we don't have problems, it's not true. Then we are vulnerable, susceptible to all kinds of manipulations that we see in the various forms of stimulation people look to when they are without rudder, without foundation, without anchor.
Thank you, David.
If I could pop in a word, Aaron, during my few words, I expressed how much I was struck by the roots of Christianity and Judaism when David was talking. And I would also stress the importance of difference, because we live in a society which fears difference. We're becoming tribalized, seeking the like-minded. And I think at the heart of certainly Christianity, there is an embrace of difference. 4 gospels, 4 different irreconcilable accounts of the life of Jesus. The embrace of Old and New Testament. So I think it's immensely refreshing to delight and to preserve difference. I think when I was listening to Yahya, I was very struck by fasting, obviously. And in my tradition, fasting is of great importance to deepen desire. What afflicts us is not often that we desire terrible things, that we are overpowered by awful desires. Often our affliction is that our society seduces us with small, superficial desires, the things that do not satisfy us. And part of the role of fasting in my tradition is to liberate us so that we may truly desire what is most wonderful.
Thank you, Timothy. Yahya, would you like to step into?
Well, yes, very briefly, thank you. Actually, I think that the first point that Rabbi David Rosen mentioned is quite important, because sometimes there is a very superficial approach where one believes that we can get along together if we forget of our identity and we find only our commonalities. I think the true challenge in being a wise and a sensitive and a humble and a honest person is actually to respect diversities and understand the complexities as a richness of mankind. And this is also part of the symbolism of all religious traditions and doctrines. So syncretism or relativism as an approach to make things light are unfortunately, if I may play with the words, it's an approach to make things rather dark. While we need to have a sensitive and a wise approach to be enlightened through the making a dialogue which is never a a changement of identity, but it's rather an occasion to discover our identity through the true identity of our interlocutor. And this is, I think, a great challenge of wisdom, but also a great challenge for those who believe in a religion, of our quest for truth. Because it cannot be my own truth, it has to be the truth. And I only can try to discover how to be more honest and sincere towards the truth through a sincere dialogue with the other, respecting him as he is, which means that fasting or eating a meal or a simple ritual can have similarities, but they have a specific complexity which needs to be discovered as a different complexity, although it seems the same symbol. The symbol of prayer, the symbol of fasting are common to our traditions, but they are teachings that allow us and help us to discover some new dimensions that, although we might not share, are very spiritually interesting for our spiritual growth.
Thank you, Yahya.
Aaron, may I respond to Katie?
I was just about to bring Katie's question into the conversation, so maybe I'll just share that with everyone. So Katie is asking about the necessity of discipline, and she notes that it seems to sometimes or often stifle her sense of spontaneity or her spontaneous sense of spiritual connection and awe. How to reconcile these two things? And so David, it'd be wonderful to have you step in.
Thank you. But I think Katie is really touching in another way upon what I was saying in a different way. In other words, we've got to, I mentioned that at the heart of religiosity, the heart of spirituality is spontaneity. But if we simply wait for the spontaneous and do not have any ritual structure with which to serve as a vessel, then very often the spontaneous doesn't happen. But the need for discipline is something that we all experience in our daily life. And of course, especially now during COVID-19. I mean, I'm sure that Kate will understand that the discipline that we've taken upon ourselves, not to hug and kiss one another the way we have done to members of our family and friends in the same way, to be social distancing with regards to our neighbors, are steps we take because we recognize that this is both an expression of respect under the circumstances and its protection. And we all have various forms of disciplines in our daily life that we exercise by virtue of social convention. We don't all behave instinctively in every particular manner, otherwise there would be complete chaos in life. The question, of course, is how to always be able to utilize these disciplines in a manner that is not stifling, and therefore to ensure that we are in accordance with its goal. And none of these disciplines, if we see them only as disciplines, but are out of sync, if you like, with the telos, the goal, the aspiration, then there is indeed a danger and it can become stifling. I mean, all good things can be abused. If the family becomes the be-all and end-all, you have the mafia. If a people becomes the be-all and end-all, you have national chauvinism. All these things can be abused. Food, which is a blessing, can become gluttony. Sex can be abused. This doesn't mean that they are bad. The challenge is how to be able to ensure that these aspects of life contribute to a spiritual ennoblement and raising our consciousness. So the spontaneity is very important, but that spontaneity precisely needs to live with these structures, these vessels that enable that spontaneity to express itself within some structures. So finding that balance is the goal. And I say again, if you have not had a framework of discipline that you have been blessed to have been given by your parents, by your community, as I think the three of us have, then it's not a simple thing to do, but it is certainly possible. There are many that do it. And one can introduce it in limited ways, finding that discipline in that time. After all, meditation is a discipline. Prayer is a discipline. It means finding the time to be able to do it and setting aside times for spiritual growth and nurturing is critically important for our well-being and that of our community around us.
I could just follow on, Aaron. I agree completely with what David says. And let me just give you an illustration. Andy Murray, great tennis player. On the court, he performs with glorious spontaneity, which is precisely the fruit of years and years of discipline. Another example might be poetry. Poetry is highly disciplined language, but it's a discipline which is at the service of expression. And I think any elimination of discipline would actually just leave us dumb and fumbling in the dark. And so I agree entirely. I think there can be no spontaneity without a long apprenticeship of discipline.
Thank you, Timothy. I would love to raise another question that's been shared in the chat as well. And I'll frame this also by saying it's wonderful to see the three of you come together representing three great traditions and also having done so much in terms of interreligious dialogue at a moment where there are a lot of polarized conversations. And a question that's put into the chat is, and in terms of really appreciating diversity, holding space to meet the other, is how can we respect and value people who seem to be not respectful of others, perhaps even from our perspective, selfish and dishonest? So I'll just put that out there as a question.
Perhaps while the others are thinking of something more intelligent to say, I think the first, all communality, all community is based on truthfulness. St. Augustine of Hippo defined the human community as the community of truth. And so when we meet people who seem to be disrespectful, perhaps aggressive towards us, I think the first basis of constructing any conversation is truth. All humanity is tied together by the gentle art of conversation. And there's no conversation without truth.
Yes, if I may add to this, very interesting. I think this touches really one of the most common complexities in interpersonal relationships, because it's the question of if he is honest, I will be honest. If he is not honest, I am not anymore forced to be honest as well, which is a very, I think, childish approach. It is spontaneous, if you like, but it is not what would be a discipline of a religious way of considering relations. The Islamic tradition would start by focusing on what is your intention, and on the other side would also teach on beware not to be selfish, which means that if your intention, as it was mentioned by Timothy, is truth, then your challenge is to be honest and sincere in every different condition. So you're not going to be honest according to what happens in front of you or behind you. You are honest because you are looking for a consistency, towards the truth. And so what happens is actually a challenge to see how far your intention is consistent with the goal you are looking for. And if you are not consistent, then the answer is that you are selfish, because you are not looking for something that is in your heart and beyond your horizontal and superficial vision, but you are actually considering the occasions of life only for a personal selfish interest. And this is where, when you are selfish, you find a conflictual, competitive attitude towards someone who is honest, or even someone who is not honest, because you are conflicting and competing with him according to his way of approaching your path. While if your intention is towards harmony, towards peace, towards truth, then in somehow the dialogue is an occasion to strengthen your intention and not to be selfish.
I agree, of course, with the very important things that my colleagues have mentioned. I might come at the challenge from a slightly different angle. Today I devote myself vocationally to the field of interfaith relations. I came to this field out of a commitment to social justice when I was a rabbi in Cape Town during the height of apartheid. And one of the few ways you could bring people together over the racial barriers that were set up by an iniquitous government was actually through religion. So it was through a commitment to social justice I came to interfaith work. And as I got involved, I realized how important it was, and I got hooked on it, and it became the major, as I say, vocational passion of my life. But there was a kind of an epiphany, a moment, when I encountered people, and to be honest, I hadn't seriously encountered Christians or Muslims, let alone Hindus, before this journey started. And for the first time, I had to ask myself the question. I had always grown up thinking, certainly, that my own tradition was true and was the right way. I never bothered really to reflect upon what the significance of other religious traditions meant. And I discovered such wonderful people and such enrichment through that encounter. And it became clear to me suddenly, I remember thinking that obviously if God has created us in all our diversity, there must be diverse ways of relating to him. And keeping that idea continuously in mind has been enormously helpful for me, as well as, of course, the most fundamental, I would say, Jewish social teaching, or biblical teaching, that the human being, every human being, is created in the divine image. I think if one can understand that there are unlimited paths to the divine, and that that should instill in us a certain amount of theological humility, understanding that no one tradition can encapsulate the totality of the divine. Indeed, God is more than any one religion. And I think that awareness can be very helpful, and especially if we see each other as a child of God, that is very important. I don't, for 1 minute, want to suggest that I succeed in living up to these ideals. I continuously fail. And I get more irritation from within my own community than I often get from people from outside other communities. But these are the things we have to strive for. And I think those values can help sustain us in encounters, in difficult encounters. And I have always found that to be the case.
If I could add just one little thing, I think we live in a very violent society. Verbally violent, physically violent, unjust violent structures. And we see this particularly at this moment, I think, with the death of Floyd in America. And I think Mahatma Gandhi, a Hindu, invited us with an enormous challenge for our culture, which is how we can become non-violent people. And we feel this particularly when we are in contact with people who are disrespectful or aggressive towards us. And non-violence, which isn't just about not striking back, but it's a much more profound thing. The sort of non-violence in our hearts, where Mahatma Gandhi taught us a sort of tranquility, which enables us to live even moments of terrible tension with a quietness and an openness it of course led to his death. But it was a death, I think, that spoke to us the enormous challenge, I think, which the 21st century poses, how we may be unviolent, non-violent with each other.
David, Timothy, Yahya, thank you so much for having joined us. It's been such a treat in so many different ways to bring your voices, to bring the wisdom of your traditions into this conversation, into this community. I also want to say thank you because you guys do such incredible work. The three of you do such important work in building these bridges between religions. And for all of us, like knowing the history that our world has experienced over the last few thousand years, it's hopeful to know that these bridges can be built. It's hopeful to know that we can meet diversity. It's hopeful to know that there can be a shared space where there has been conflict. So thank you for all that you do, and thank you for having joined us today.